Hi everyone, welcome back to the development logs. In this development log I'm going to show you a very quick, hopefully a very quick video on what I've changed, both in the UI and in the functionality of Hive. I fixed a few bugs regarding some startup functions and stuff, which if you're a programmer you would have potentially come across. And I've also fixed some GUI bugs. The most prevalent of these bugs has been bugging me forever, and it's the antenna implementation. The folding implementation. And so I can show you an example of what this folding means. If I had an always trigger and a, let's see, debug print, no, an action actuator, connect the two, you'll see that I have this expand option. And if I just try this a bit bigger, this expand option is basically a means of creating a variable that can be used to input data rather than having the GUI control it. So it's quite useful if you want to sometimes get rid of the nodes and just have a constant defined on the worker. Now the problem with this was that when you loaded things in, they'd all pop out and expand like this, even if they were folded when you saved the file. And copying and pasting produced different results, and sometimes you'd get workers which had pins and they were in the expanded state, so they had their pin shown but they didn't have any variables connected, so that it would fail. Therefore we'd have to either fold it or then fold it and unfold it again. So it caused lots of problems for me anyway, and I rewrote some of that code today so that it works hopefully properly. So we can demonstrate that if we expand this, save the blend file and then reload it, and go back to the which node tree was I on? I think I was on a different node tree. Hold on, let me just check that. Oh, that's interesting. I have made a mistake. Oh well, it doesn't matter. And then trigger always action and quickly expand that, connect it, save it, and then reload it, and that works. I think it's just a bug with what I've done there. Yeah, so this basically now loads correctly. It didn't before. And if you copy and paste or duplicate, they now function correctly. So we can expand that, and if we duplicate this without the variable, then it will give you the ability to expand it because it knows you haven't connected it. Or if you duplicate all three, then it says you can now fold it, which is the benefit. So everything should hopefully work correctly. So a little bit more information. This is the main node tree, and this is what runs without a bound object, and it runs from the start of the game. So this is what you might start spawning object. Sorry, this is where you'll spawn any potential like global game logic from. So now we have two objects, and I've also decided to move the Hive logic panel from the logic brick window. The reason we moved it from the logic brick window was very simple. The logic brick window is mostly dominated by the sensors, controllers and actuators of the logic brick system, and they're not useful for Hive. So the only real thing you want to do is show the properties panel, and therefore you might as well have a very small window like this text window is and just show the properties panel of the logic editor. The problem with that is that the panel will sometimes show and hide depending on the resolution of your monitor, and it's a little bit inconsistent and clunky. So what I've decided to do is simply get rid of that editor. We don't need it for Hive, and just copy the code which creates the properties into this object properties Hive logic panel. And I've also added a bound node tree option, which we had in the old panel. So now this is where you'll use your Hive logic from, and it's quite useful because you're going to be basically editing your physics or your logic here, so it's a little bit more user friendly, I think anyway. And who knows, it might not be permanent. And if I just quickly get rid of this timeline, and so that's helpful. Now another thing we've done is if we add a new node tree, call it cube, and create a bound Hive map with these two objects both connected to cube, then there might be times when you want to actually either rename this, and before when you renamed it, it would cause errors. Now if we call it cube renamed, you'll see that both of these objects have now got the renamed version in their node tree and also in the game property down here. So that's a little bit more useful. Sometimes there might be times when you delete the Hive map, and if you do that, you'll notice that both of these objects lose their reference without going red, which is good. And also if I add the node tree again, call it cube, and add the users back, sometimes you might want to delete the users but not the Hive map, and to do that, there's now an operator called remove users, and you go on Hive options and click that, and any bound objects will be cleared of the node tree. Now a quick mention about these properties, we don't support the timer property in Hive because although it does work in the game engine, it won't work in Panda 3D, for example, if you exported the blend file. And ultimately, you shouldn't rely on Blender-specific code to run Hive. Hive should basically just run itself. So don't use timers. They're very easy to get from the standard library in Dragonfly. And to show you that, I'll quickly find the correct one. It's in time, and you can basically use all of this. You have interval time, pacemaker simple. You shouldn't add. I don't know why I did that. That's part of the main Hive code. But you've got all of these things like interpolation, interval time, interval ticks, and you can just read the value out from that, for example. So you don't need to create a timer property. So now I've just rebound these cubes, Hive maps. These cubes to the Hive map cube, and in the Hive map cube, let's now add a Sparta actuator, and it's going to be the stop actuator. We're also going to add another actuator called the debug print actuator, which is up here, and this is just for so we can read from the console. Let's put this over here. We're also going to add a trigger. It's going to be an if trigger. We're going to connect both of these to the if trigger, and then we're also going to create a keyboard sensor and connect it as follows. Now, let's set the keyboard sensor key to space, which is over here, and we're leaving on detect key presses. Now, in the stop actuator, you'll see that we have delete object, and we can also create an unbound instance. Now, if you create an unbound instance, all it will do, unlike most of the time where it will ask you for an identifier, the unbound instance of the stop actuator just gets rid of the delete option. So if we create a bound version, and you'll see we can delete the object when you run this actuator, but we're not going to do that for now, so you can see what happens. So with the console shown, the keyboard and everything set up, press P, and you'll see that when I press space, hold on, have I done this right? I think I changed it to the W key, hold on. It was just the fact that the engine was being slow when we started. So press P and the engine starts, and when I press space, you'll see it says triggered. And if I press space again, it doesn't do anything. That's because we run the stop actuator, and that stops the Hive process that we're currently in. Every bound object has a bound Hive process, which is running the Hive map. And if you stop that process, then it stops processing the Hive map. And the way we stop it is we basically stop the Hive in question from receiving any events. Everything is triggered by an event. The if trigger is being triggered by events to check the keyboard sensor. The always triggers are being triggered by events. So if you delete those events, then there's no way that Hive can update unless you've inserted a plugin, which would be bad, so don't do that. And so this Hive basically stops running. And you'll notice we had two triggered statements because there are two objects running this Hive map. If we check delete object and press P, and then press space, you'll see they're both deleted. And again, if I press space, nothing else is printed because they stopped processing. So this is how you can use the stop actuator to end your Hive. If you wanted to end the game globally, you have two options. You can either create a special stop event or run the exit plugin, neither of which are exposed to the UI at the moment, or you just go into your main Hive map and add the code there. And that way, if I added a let's say a keyboard sensor, if trigger, and let's set this keyboard sensor to a key that isn't escape, like D, and you'll have to take my word that I press D, and then take the stop actuator and connect it. Now if I try to start this by default, you'll get an error because you get these obscure errors. Basically it's looking for a plugin called entity bound, but we didn't expose one because we're not a bound Hive map. So change this to unbound and that won't happen. And you'll see now we can start the game, and if I press D, the entire game stops. Equally, if I press escape, the entire game stops. So the running this in the main Hive closes everything, and I'll try and expose that in a friendly way for you if you're using bound Hives. Another important thing about bound Hives is that if you create a Hive process using the add object actuator or the launch process actuator, which are in the actuators here, we have launch, which basically creates, it's like creating the logic without the object, or object here. If you run any of these, both of which create, the object creates a process if you ask it to. Those processes aren't children of this process at the moment. So if you ended this process, these children would still work. They work separately. And that's because they all run in the main Hive map. I'm going to potentially add that as a feature in the future so that you can basically store logic within logic, and if you end the top one they all stop. But for now it's not supported. So that's most of the changes I've made. I've implemented that new stop actuator, which is quite useful. So I'll keep you posted. Most of the bugs have now been fixed, which is sort of good, as long as they stay fixed. Another important note is that copying and pasting doesn't work across node trees or across workers and hives. This bit makes much more sense because you don't want to have Hive nodes in the worker node tree. The fact that you can't copy them between node trees is at the moment just an implementation detail, and I might change that depending on what I see fit. It all depends on what people say. So thank you for watching, and I'll keep you posted.